Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes a todos y todas los que nos acompañan en esta cápsula para la Cátedra Bourgeois-Pichat. Es un honor poder estar el día de hoy con Catherine Wihtol de Wenden, quien nos visita. Ella es directora de investigación del CNRS, el Centro National de la Recherche Scientifique, y vamos a tener el día de hoy una plática muy interesante con ella en inglés sobre lo que se discutió en la cátedra, pero también reflexiones en cuanto a las similitudes y diferencias que se viven aquí en la región de las Américas, específicamente en México. Bonjour, Catherine. Bonjour. Welcome. Merci. It has been a real pleasure to have you here at El Colegio de México. We had a week with you, and you had a chance to meet with students, to meet with colleagues, to give two very interesting presentations. I had the honor to comment on the first one when you discussed the book of Les figures de l'autre, Las figuras del otro, and then yesterday we had a discussion on migrations at the Mediterranean. Yes. And first of all, I would like to start with a conversation on migration to France. Yes. Because I think that we need to understand this first, located it in migrations within the Mediterranean overall, yes, but also try to link on how different people on the move have been perceived, yes, differently over time. And your book is very, very rich in providing this historical perspective of how migrants have been perceived, but also refugees, asylum seekers, unauthorized or irregular populations. And I think that we need to start by understanding what is going on and what has been going on with this historical perspective. And it's hard to summarize what you do in so many different works. You are very, very prolific, and you have written a lot on this. But how do we understand migration to France?
Yes, first, France is a very old immigration country, a very small emigration country, but for a long time, France, differently with other European countries, began its migration story in the mid-19th century. So we have a country of immigration, but it is not well accepted and sometimes ignored by the public opinion because for a long time there was no history about migration in France. So there is some illegitimacy in the public opinion on the immigrant presence.
Now, I think we need to go back to colonialism, right? Yes. If we want to understand. And here in Mexico, we were a colony from Spain. Yes. There was a process of independence. There was also a process of historical immigration of the French, for example, Spaniards. We lost half of our country to the United States. So, of course, there are historical relations and political, sociocultural exchanges. That is for us, it's very clear that we are a natural migration pair, as you said, or like we have these exchanges. And what you explained yesterday was that there are many countries that have these dyads, these exchanges for historical reasons and cultural reasons, but there are others that receive people from everywhere, right? Yes. So where do we locate France within these different systems?
I think we are very strongly focused on the former colonial migration, mostly Algeria, which is now the first presence between all the nationalities in France. But some years ago, it was the Portuguese who have been also very numerous and who are still there in our country. But France, like many other European countries, is not mostly concerned by this post-colonial migration. It is also the case of UK, of Spain, of Portugal. Half of migration in Europe now comes for Europe, which is EU countries, because there is freedom of circulation, of settlement and of work, but also due to the new countries which entered into Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is mostly Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and some others. And now we became European, but also other European countries which are not in the EU, like Albania, for example, for Greece, Ukraine, even before the conflict with Russia, and Moldavia. So European nationalities are very strongly represented differently in various EU countries because it is linked to the story, to the transnational networks, and so on. But Europe is not only involved in post-colonial migration.
And I like to think about the similarities with Mexico. And yesterday we were talking a lot about, the Mediterranean is this border between Europe, Africa, Asia. Yes. And within Asia you have the Arab countries, we have the Middle East, you have what you call the really close, the Proche Orient, the really close, the countries that do have next to the sea, to the Mediterranean Sea, and you have this natural border that we have always, well, many of us have compared the Mediterranean with the Rio Bravo in bordering Mexico and US. But here in Mexico, what we have seen is an increase of extra-regional flows. Yes. Today we have refugee and asylum seekers from every country, from Africa, from Asia. We have, of course, people from Central America that are coming, from Venezuela and Haiti. We have return migration flows. And in a sense, when I was listening to your presentation yesterday, it was a presentation of history of Europe for me. It was, you need to understand migration in the Mediterranean in relation to what was happening in history, right? Yes. Even when you were mentioning how there was somehow a decline of Europe when the Americas started to, when the Spaniards and Portuguese, started to come here, right? But of course, there was always this exchange. You have colonial exchange, you have migration, you have wars, you have conflict, you have poverty, you have all these different contexts that are happening in different countries that we here on the other side of the Pacific, we also live, on the Atlantic, we are also living. But when I'm trying to do some comparisons and trying to think what is really different, I would say, and I want your opinion on this, is that we do not have an issue with religion and language as you have, right? You have much more tension because of this. But in terms of the images of the stereotypes, the negative perceptions, the myths around migration, we have very similar patterns and very similar reactions, right? Yes. But in your book, you do highlight the role of religion. And I really want to go further because we do not see, our territories as clearly divided by these other origins of conflict, right? And it has been key for Europe and for integrating migrants and for accepting others and how this otherness has been defined. So I think we need to go further on that.
Yes, but the impact which is put on Islam is rather recent in EU countries, not because the population of Islamic culture were not there, because between 1950s and the end of the last century, there were Turkish in Germany, for example. There were Maghrebians in France and some others in other countries, the Pakistanis in UK. But the stress on religion as a divide has been introduced after the end of the US Russia bilateral relation. When the Russia collapsed, Huntington wrote an article on the clash of civilizations, and the other event has been the rising importance of Islam due to the money of Gulf countries. Gulf countries, due to the rise of the price of oil, could accompany the construction of building of mosque, the visibility of Islam in countries of Islam like Maghreb, Turkey, but also in EU countries. So there has been a rise of the presence of Islam in everyday life for many EU countries. Before, it was not so important because the Islamic population was rather small, and also because they were poor, so they did not show the visibility of their belonging to religion. They were part of the working class in big industries and mines, and so the stress was not put for them on religion. And sometimes in the firms, for example in Renault car industry, they told me sometimes we preferred to have Islamic people because they were not drinking alcohol, and there were a lot of accidents at work due to alcohol in construction industry, in car factories, and many other in mines and so on. So the question of Islam was not so important, and Islam was also very present in Algeria, which was France, until 1962.
Trying to divide what we see recently and what are the recent issues and sources of tension, and thinking what was happening before. I mean, I would say in the 1980s, we were more interested and more concerned about refugees arriving by boat, these in the US and Canada, but also in Europe. But in the 80s, there was also a big change in Europe in terms of the European Union and the Schengen Treaty. So I'm wondering if the real source of tension then, I mean, really started to be, I mean, Islam later, but the division on who can move freely and who cannot, and how we define who is eligible for moving or for entering the EU, for arriving, for applying for asylum, for providing protection. And so kind of like, I would like to go back a little bit, I mean, also to the 80s into how this was defined and freedom of circulation was so crucial.
Yes, in mid-80s, in 1985, it was decided to organize the so-called Schengen system. Schengen is a small village in Luxembourg with 3 borders with Germany, Netherlands, and Belgium. It is the reason why it was chosen as a symbol of Europe for this agreement. And the decision was to divide between Europeans of the Union and non-Europeans. And non-Europeans had to hold a passport with a visa in order to enter into Europe, in order and with difficulties to have access to work, because in many EU countries they had closed the possibility to enter as a worker, especially a low qualified worker. So the only people which were allowed to enter in Europe were the Europeans for work, for settlement, and for also mobility, whereas for the others it was much more difficult. So this legal divide between Europeans and non-Europeans became very important, but Europe enlarged also its members rapidly with the entrance of Portugal, Spain, Greece, and then Finland, Austria, Sweden, and then Eastern country after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And most of the newcomers were the 2 most populated countries from East Europe, which is Poland and Romania. So it has totally changed the approach. So the stress was put on Europe, European workers, and it increased the divide between North and South. Before the divide, the security divide was between East and West, and there was the so-called Iron Curtain. And after, this period in the 1990s, because new treaties were adopted by the EU countries about asylum, Dublin Agreement, and so on, the new divide was between North and South. And this is a very important geopolitical change.
I read the book, so I know it is true. But to what extent you can, I mean, if you can talk a little bit about how the EU changed also the definition of us and them, right? And so, I mean, it's interesting what you say in terms of the divide. I mean, the Cold War, this divide on the East and the West, then the South and the North. It meant also we are Europeans and you are not. Yes. And it also meant to some extent the essentialization of the other in terms of, I mean, like thinking that, I don't know, Africa will invade us without thinking who are these people or which countries are they coming from, or differences within this population. So in that way, it really homogeneized the other in many different ways, or associating it with the poor, the sauvage, as you say, like and then the bravery and these ideas that even with the language use of how the others are referred to. But I mean, this is not new because you in the book trace this to very, very long periods, but also how it has changed. But if we want to locate the 1980s and then what happened later in the 2000s, I'm wondering how, I mean, we cannot go back to change the past, and the EU has had lots of advantages. But I don't know if you have any idea what would have happened if there was not this construction for both the perception of migration, the perception of us as Europeans, well, you are Europeans, but this idea of us and them, and the idea of what it means for the others, right? Yes. And I'm just thinking this because we discuss a lot here in Latin America whether or not we have a Latin American identity. We discussed also on Tuesday about the idea of mestizaje and how it tries to kind of like, to some extent, deal with the difference here in Mexico. And so, of course, there is not free movement between Mexico and the United States, but in the Mercosur, there is free movement. There is free movement in other instances. So I'm wondering how free movement and this definition of geopolitical regions actually affect these perceptions of others more general, and what would have happened if we can even just try to think what the impact of the EU formation.
Yes. The EU has changed the legitimacy of many new nationalities which entered into Europe. For example, in the past, the Portuguese were entered mostly illegally into Europe because they were fleeing the Salazar dictatorial regime, and they were very poor also. So they went to cross the border between Spain and France, and they entered illegally. So the image of the Portuguese population was illegals, while in the same period, the Algerians were legal, because when Algeria was France and also after the independence, they had freedom of circulation to move between the South Stream and the North Stream of the Mediterranean. So in terms of legitimacy, there were many others who had some possibilities to move due to the story, mostly access to citizenship from people from Senegal, for example. So the others were the Eastern population, because there was the Iron Curtain, and those who entered were refugees. But for the others, there was quite no possibility to enter. So Europe has changed progressively the us and we, because the Greeks became us, Romania, progressively Poland, and some Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on. So it has enlarged Europe at east, while it was progressively closing at south due to the Schengen system differentiating Europeans and non-Europeans. But in the same time, we have a lot of proximities, for French, for example, with Maghreb, because it was France in the past. They are sharing our language. We have a lot of transnational networks built by migrants and a lot of cultural exchanges also, while we don't know at all the culture of Moldavia, for example, or some region of Romania, which are very far from the story we have learned at school. So it is, and also the problem of Roma population, Gypsies population in these Eastern Europe is a new border for us in the mentalities, in the view, because they considered that these gypsies trying to cross the border for most of them, quite most of them Europeans, is a new border too, because their way of life is very different from the settled population in Europe. So there are a lot of borders, but the geopolitical impact is very important to define who are we and who are them, and how these moving borders can change the image of the other.
And what I really found fascinating reading the book was that you talk a lot about how dynamic are these concepts, and how also for understanding its dynamism, you need to know history, you need to have a sociological perspective, a psychological perspective, knowledge on migration, on economics.
Yes.
And I think that, of course, the book will be read differently by an economist or a sociologist, but I think it's really interesting how, for us here in Mexico, we are starting to think more often what it means to be a destination country, what it means to be an immigration country, what it means to receive returnees, what it means for us that people are leaving, right? People are applying for asylum. And I cannot, I couldn't stop thinking of the implications for policy.
Yes.
And for policies, I would say in plural, because you did discuss yesterday when we were discussing migrations in the Mediterranean, the role of development that didn't necessarily work for stopping migration, enforcement and control that has not worked, right? Has made the trip more risky. We see images of children dead in the Mediterranean Sea, but also here in the Mexico-US border, and this doesn't stop people from migrating. You see externalization, you see more funding for technology that actually increases security, the so-called security, and this is not stopping, right? Migration is still a constant. And it also seems that as the flows change and as migration changes, routes change, the people who is receiving, the countries who are receiving these migrants are still trying, on the one hand, to control, on the other one, to help. There's also a lot of solidarity with these populations, a lot of empathy. There's a lot of clash between the governments and the activists, for example. We don't see that here in Mexico as hard as you see that in the Mediterranean. But you see all these tensions, and you see these narratives in the media, these negative stereotypes. And I think there are many things that are similar there. But I would really like to think on policy, because, we talked a little bit about it, that you need legal channels for migration. Yes. You need free mobility. But kind of like, what would you say are the lessons from Europe that here in Mexico we should be thinking on? Because, we already tried the same things, and the same things that don't work. And it depends what we want, right? It depends if we want to integrate migrants, to live cohesively, or it depends if we want to think in a very wrong way, that we will actually be able to control migrant flows, right? But I really think that, it would be great to have your appreciation and policies in general.
Yes, thanks. Perhaps the question of opening more the borders is an emergency for Mexico and the US, alike for neighbors of Europe to Europe. Because if we close the border, we have a lot of negative effects. For example, all the more we close the border, all the more the illegals will use traffickers, all the more they have chances to die in the desert and after in the Mediterranean. And when they succeed to enter, they will stay, because they cannot come back. So the mobility, which is also an aspiration of most of this population, especially between the North Rim and the South Rim of Mediterranean, is stopped, and economically also stopped, culturally stopped, due to the closing of borders. So we have a lot of illegals hoping for possible or sometimes impossible legalization and a settlement in precarity of most of this population. So they have poor jobs, they don't earn a lot of money, they cannot send a lot of money to their country of origin, they have not access to some social rights, and it is a very strange situation in the 21st century. So I think the most important point is opening more legal possibilities to enter, and especially at work, because a lot of EU countries, except for Germany, who reopened its borders for work, have closed their borders for work, which is a real problem. And it would solve also the question of refugees, because a lot of people, as they cannot enter as workers, try, because it is possible, to be applicant to the refugee status. Some of them fit with the Geneva Convention, and some of them don't, because they are false asylum seekers, I could say. So the hotspots, which have been created after the Syrian crisis of 2015 in Italy and Greece, have to select those who fit with the profile and those who don't. It is a lot of work. It does not work, as there are camps and jungles and many other places like that, with all this population to be divided, and so it increases the treatment of asylum seekers with people who fit, and sometimes it is very difficult, because imagine somebody coming from sub-Saharan Africa. The political regime are in crisis. We have had 2 civil wars during these last times, and also 7 million people left Sudan, for example, recently to neighbor countries. So are they asylum seekers? Are they people looking for job? Difficult to define. And sometimes there are also environmentally displaced people mixed with the profile of refugees, mixed with the people of young people looking for job. So the categories of migrants are blurring, which makes very difficult to have a real immigration policy, which makes the difference between refugee statuses. We cannot refuse to apply the Geneva Convention because we signed it in European countries since 1951, but we can manage or not the question of work. We cannot prohibit the family reunification because it is quite a constitutional right in European countries. So now we are in a chaos for the fitting the profiles with the legal policies. And on that, there is populism, which says we have to refuse because we want to refuse these newcomers. We don't know them because refugees from all over the world, and also because they can be dangerous. Some of them are coming from Islamic countries, and some of them, but very few, have practiced terrorism in EU countries. So if we don't accept the idea to open more legally the borders to newcomers, it will be impossible to have a real immigration policy, rational and respecting the categories of migrants, and respecting the needs, economic and demographic needs of EU countries, which were becoming older and older.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking we need to start wrapping up, and I wanted to to go to the demographic question, because I mean the Cátedra Bourgeois-Pichat is a Cátedra de Demografía Bourgeois-Pichat, and it has a long tradition, many years of bringing French scholars, especially from INED, to actually talk about demographic processes. And when we were organizing the program for this year, we always talked about the role, I mean, how we could link the role of migration, the role of otherness to demographic issues. And of course, one of the differences between, I mean, Europe and the Mediterranean and our region is that we are going through a much slower process here in Mexico and in Latin America of aging, but we're going in the same direction. We are not as old as Canada or the United States. Canada implemented in the 1980s an immigration policy based on demography. They very specifically said, we want 1% of the population each year to replace, to compensate for population growth. The United States has not started already a decline, but the new recent population projections for the U.S. actually show that, I mean, it's going there as well. Mexico is going there as well. We are below replacement in fertility. So, I mean, we have this difference. But I really want to go and talk about, and this is how you started your talk yesterday, is really pushing forward the idea that Europe has this need, but also in the book, you include this as a myth.
Yes.
And so I really want to talk about this contradiction of, yes, Europe needs younger people, let's say.
And newcomers.
But at the same time, it's not going to solve necessarily the problems of declining population. Or, I mean, what can you explain us?
The only factor of increase of the population in Europe is migration. If we would not have migration, the population will be older and older. First. Second, but in the mentality, this idea is very badly accepted because EU countries are stressing with populist parties also on the myth of autochthony. So many countries, many public opinions do not want globalization, which is at world level, and so do not want so many exchanges which is we can see them in economy, in culture, and so on. They want to be totally closed in the midst of an autochthonous country with people who have roots on the place and who would be a kind of a pure population of French, of German, of Italian, and so on. And this is very common. It is very strange because a country like France, which has had more than 150 years of migration, are dreaming about autochthony. If you are going to Poland, they are dreaming about autochthony. In Austria, which was a great empire, and Hungary, which was belonging to Austria, there was a lot of nationalities, and all this population contributed to make a very brilliant culture in this empire. If you go to the University of Vienna, you see all the prizes they won in all disciplines due to, with names impossible to pronounce, coming from all over the empire. So it is a total myth because it does not represent the reality. Hungary, when I began to work on Eastern Europe, was the country where the minorities were most studied during the communist regime. They had a real work about minorities because it was the reality of Hungary. And now we have a president who is stressing on the myth of an Hungarian total pureness of the population, while it was belonging to a very important empire. So we have a lot of, but it is mostly from the public opinion, which considers it is victim of globalization, victim of the competition with others. And so those who have the feeling to have lost all. The only phenomenon they consider as important is that they are they have roots in the country, and they consider they are more legitimate than others than would not have roots in the country. So the looking for roots is very important in the populist programs in many EU countries.
I want to finish with a positive note. So I have two last questions. The first one is, and I'm biased because I know the answer because it's in the book, but I really want you to talk a little bit about the Museum of the History of Immigration, because I think it shows something positive at the end, right? A win. That is my first question. And then I'll have a very small last question.
Yes, the museum was decided at the beginning of the 21st century by Jacques Chirac, when the left in power before had refused the idea of a museum of migration. And it was very, I participate from the beginning, 2003 until now. I am still in the scientific council of the museum. The legitimacy was very fragile in the beginning because the power was fearing the reactions of the extreme right, especially because also the museum was settled in the former colonial museum of the French exhibition of 1931. So there was a refusal to make a museum on that place, and some people wanted to stress just on the working class, even if migration in France was not just a working class. There were elites or a lot of refugees from everywhere in the world and so on. So it was progressively we worked a lot in order to propose the opening of the museum in 2007. Nicolas Sarkozy, who was our president of the Republic, refused to make the inauguration of the museum because in the same time he had a very hard and populist immigration policy of closure. And now it is better, not because the ideas that France is a great country of immigration, which is true, but because the museum has done a lot of things, of cultural events. So we are speaking to the children at school who are visiting the museum. We are speaking to the professors in order to teach that migration is an important phenomenon in France. We have a lot of cultural events, discussions with intellectuals, exhibitions, and so on. So due to the activity of the museum, it works better, and we don't show just this history of poor migration of the 30 glorious years, so-called 1954, 1975, but all the aspects of migration, the creation in the la mode, in the fashion, for example, the painters, the writers of books, all what has been brought culturally by migration. So now it is more visited, and there is an increase of the activities of the museum. It works like a museum.
And I think I mean it's at least for me it's very personally important, because I think here at el Colegio de México, at the seminar that I coordinate, we have been trying to visibilize more migration to Mexico. And I think that having different perceptions of migrants and refugees and the other will start by also acknowledging how present migration is in different ways, right? Not only associating it with poverty or things that you're missing and belonging. So I have a very last question, and I learned a lot. I know the students learned a lot. I know the colleagues had a great time, and I really hope that you can come back to Mexico and here at el Colegio de Mexico. But I would ask you, what do you think you would present in the next visit? Yes. What are you working on now for the future?
Thank you. Perhaps I could present the impact of migration in international relations. In the past, migration was totally absent for the topics of international migration, and now migration has changed a lot. The work on borders, the work on citizenship, the soft diplomacy, which is led by countries of origin with country of arrival, many new and also contracting new agreements, having an impact with the Marrakesh agreement of 2018. So I think that this problem of migration becoming a more legitimate topic in international relations, I wrote a book on this topic, is a very important issue. But I wanted to mention about the museum that the subtitle of the museum in France, which was many illegitimate for years, is Our Story of Migrants. Their story is our story. It is very important to put in the mentalities that migration is a legitimate story also of France, which was not taught before.
And with that, we will finish. Merci beaucoup, Catherine.
Merci.
Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Están las grabaciones de los dos eventos de las presentaciones de la Cátedra de Demografía Bourgeois-Pichat. Y al final, Catherine decía que en realidad va a trabajar en cómo las migraciones están presentes en las relaciones internacionales. Y la cátedra este año fue, se llevó a cabo gracias al apoyo de la Coordinación General Académica. Participaron activamente el Centro de Estudios Internacionales, el CEDUA, el Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas, el Cuerpo Académico Dinámica Demográfica, lo que muestra que para la migración, para las relaciones internacionales, para la ciencia política, son intereses muy importantes y que se necesita trabajar de manera colaborativa. We're working together.
It was a real pleasure to
Merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias y los esperamos en más discusiones sobre migración, demografía, relaciones internacionales y ciencia política. Gracias.